All right. Good evening, guys. Thank you very much for joining the live event tonight. And yes, I did have a very good Mid-Autumn festival. Thanks for asking, Xiaolu. I didn't do much. We had 4 days off. I mostly stayed home with my wife and little boy, who will turn 1 year old in a couple of weeks, and spend some times with colleagues, friends, and family. So pretty relaxed. It felt good to have some time off. And yes, of course, this gave me some time to work on these workshops, to update my PPTs, to create new resources, the summaries, the concept cards, the list of definition and everything. So yeah, we are all set for tonight. So tonight we will actually finish the second unit of the AS syllabus, the price system and the microeconomy. There are three topics that we need to discuss. We need to have a look at the market equilibrium. So some things are quite straightforward in this topic, just like, okay, how do we find the market equilibrium? What is a shortage? What is a surplus? What happens when demand or supply increases or decreases? That's the part that is pretty straightforward. However, there are some things that are a bit more tricky, like what really happens when there is a shortage? Why will the price increase or decrease when the market is in disequilibrium? So we need to look at what consumers will do, what producers will do. And something that students seem to struggle with for some reason is the concept of the price mechanism, and especially the different functions of price. So we also need to have a look at this. Then we will talk about, very briefly, it's not going to take long, we'll talk about the different relationships that can possibly exist between two different markets, depending on what relationship we have between the two markets. So there are 6 primary relationships that we need to investigate. And finally, we will discuss the concepts of consumer and producer surplus, which is usually something that is not extremely complicated. Are we ready? Let's get started. All right. Okay. So let's have a look at market equilibrium. Let's start with some very simple definitions, but sometimes the easiest keywords are the ones who are the hardest to define. Let's start with the definition of what is a market. All right, what is a market? It's just a place in which buyers and sellers, they meet to trade. So this could be trading a good, like the market for apples, could be a service, like the market for, I don't know, a hairdresser would be a service, could be assets, like a financial market where we trade stocks, for example, or even houses. This would be considered an asset, or resources, like the labor market. So yes, in the market, we do not only trade goods and services. And it's actually better to say that a market is a place where buyers and sellers meet, rather than saying it's a place where consumers and producers, because it's absolutely possible that the buyers are not consumers and that the sellers are not producers. And the best example that you can give to illustrate that is, if you are a retailer, you might purchase some products that you do not consume. Okay, you purchase some products to resell them. And if you are a retailer, you do not directly produce the good, the goods that you purchase. So of course you are part of the supply chain, but you do not physically produce the goods that you sell. Okay, so it's more accurate to say buyers and sellers rather than producers and consumers. The buyers demand the good or service or the product, and the sellers, they supply. Okay, easy. Now, a few things that a few questions that you can ask your students to just start your lesson. You can ask them what is the difference between a physical and a non-physical market. So pretty easy, and they should understand. So physical could be a store, could be a street market. So it's really a physical place, a location where you actually go to buy something. And a non-physical or a virtual market would be something like Taobao, Amazon, which is an app or website that you can browse to find products and purchase them online. That's what we call a virtual market. Okay, I've already answered that question. Do you think all buyers are consumers and all sellers are producers? Of course not. There are sometimes you buy things and you do not even consume them. Another example would be if you buy a gift for someone. So you buy the product, but then you give it to someone else, so you don't actually consume it. And the sellers, yes, sometimes the sellers, they are not producers. They, or at least they do not physically produce the product. They simply buy it and sell it at a higher price. Or could be the second-hand market. Sometimes you buy a car, you use it for a few years, and then you sell it. So you sell the car even though you haven't produced it. Okay, good. Last question that is a bit beyond the scope of the syllabus, but I think it's interesting. It's about what we call a relevant market. And what's the idea here? The typical example that you can use to illustrate that is you can just ask them, all right, let's take the example of cars. And you can ask your students to give names of a few car brands that they know. So they will tell you something like a BMW, Mercedes-Benz. And you can ask them, okay, do you think they are competing in the same market? So if you take Mercedes-Benz and BMW, so of course, yes, it depends on what models of cars we are talking about, but yeah, okay. I think most of your students will say, all right, yeah, Mercedes-Benz and BMW, they are effectively competing in the same market. But then you can try to extend that a little bit. You can try to include brands of very, very expensive cars, like sports car, Lamborghini, Ferrari, Aston Martin, like very expensive cars. And then you can ask them, okay, do you think these very expensive brands of cars, or those luxury cars, do you think they are effectively competing with Mercedes-Benz and BMW? And then they will start saying, oh, no, maybe not, because they sell very different products and they target very different customers. And you can take examples that are even more extreme. You can take, on the one hand, very expensive cars, and on the other hand, you can ask your students to give you names of very cheap cars, like usually pretty bad quality. And then you can ask them, okay, do you think these two brands, one is a very luxury brand and the other is very cheap cars, okay, they both produce, those two companies, they produce cars, but do you really think that they compete with each other? And in that case, the students will tell you, no, they don't compete, because, okay, these are cars, but they are very different characteristics. They target different market segments. So of course, these two brands are not in the same relevant market. And that's this concept of relevant market. It's essentially the market within which a competition actually takes place. Okay, so it doesn't really make sense to talk about the market for cars, okay, because there are actually many different markets for cars. First, because they can be sold in different locations, yes, and also because there are many different types of cars, models of cars, categories of cars. So there are actually several relevant markets. So that's the idea. Relevant market, it's the market within which you really have competition. Okay, it's not tested in the syllabus though, but I feel like it's quite interesting to say a few words about that. Okay, now we are ready. We talk about market equilibrium, so it's always a good idea to start by explaining, okay, what do we mean in general by equilibrium? Um, in general, an equilibrium is a situation in which there is no tendency for change. Okay, so you've probably studied or the students have probably studied the concept of equilibrium in other subjects like chemistry, physics. Um, yeah, it's a situation where that was preceded by some kind of change, and eventually the change disappears, and we reach some kind of static state that we sometimes call an equilibrium state. Okay, so if I drop my pen, it will eventually stop moving. Okay, so we can say that there will be a one time where all forces have basically compensated each other, and my pen will stop moving. We can say that we have reached some kind of equilibrium. In a market, we will simply say that the market is in equilibrium when the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. Okay, so when the market price is such that the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. That's as simple as that. And as soon as it is not the case, when one is larger than the other, we say that the market is in disequilibrium. All right, so this price, we call it the equilibrium price, no problem. We also sometimes use market clearing price. Why market clearing? Because this means that there is no surplus. So like there is no leftover. So it's like if we clear all the possible output in this market, uh, firms can clear everything that they have produced. They have nothing left. And same thing, market clearing means that everyone who wants to buy can find the product. So you do not have like buyers left in the market that would still want to purchase the product. So that's the idea of market clearing. Okay, all sellers have found buyers, all buyers have found sellers, so the market clears. Nobody stays, nobody is left unhappy once the whole trade is over. That's the idea. And the quantity is called the equilibrium quantity. Yes. All right. And that's what it means to be in equilibrium. That means that every buyer who's willing to pay the market price, the equilibrium market price, finds a seller. Okay, so is able to buy the quantity that it desires. And every seller willing to sell a certain quantity at the equilibrium price is able to find buyers willing to purchase that quantity. Okay, so basically everyone is happy. There is no quantity that is unsold, or there is no shortage, as we will see. So everybody is happy when we have the market in equilibrium. However, be careful, because having a market equilibrium does not mean that the equilibrium price is fair, right? We will see mostly in A2 that having a market in equilibrium can sometimes be efficient, okay, given that there is no market failure, but there is no guarantee that it is fair. Okay, you can very well have a market in equilibrium with a very, very high price that essentially leaves many people unable to afford the product. And remember that whether something is fair or not is highly subjective. It depends on your value, your opinions, your personal judgment of the situation. A low equilibrium price might be unfair, a high equilibrium price might be unfair. So usually if we say that a low price is unfair, that's mostly to sellers. Yeah, if you produce milk and the equilibrium price is very, very low, you might consider, if you sell milk, that this is unfair to you. And a high price is often considered unfair by buyers. If you want to buy like real estate, or if you want to rent an apartment in a very expensive city, you might consider that a very high equilibrium price is unfair because you can't afford decent housing. Okay, but this is subjective, so there is no way to tell whether it is fair or unfair. Okay, you can find the equilibrium, the market equilibrium using a table, something like this. So that's essentially, this table is a combination of a demand schedule and a supply schedule. Okay, so different quantity supplied, different quantity demanded at different prices. And the only thing that we have to do is just to try to find the market price at which the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. And in this example, clearly the market clears, the market is in equilibrium when the price is $5, because in that case, indeed, the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. For any other price, we see that this is not the case. In particular, for any price below $5, we see that the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded, a situation that we will know as excess demand or shortage. And for any price above $5, well, in this table, there is only one, but it's the opposite. The quantity supplied is actually greater than the quantity demanded, a situation that we will call a surplus or excess supply. So that's how you can show it with a table, and that's how you can show it on a diagram. So that's probably the easiest diagram and the most famous economics diagram ever, supply demand boom equilibrium. Pretty easy. So I think I can move on. If you want to take your students one step further, and if you want them to calculate a market equilibrium with a function that represents demand and a function that represents supply, this is an exercise, but again, this is beyond the scope of the syllabus. If you teach IB, of course, IB economics, students are expected to do that, but that's for A level or even AP. This is not useful, but I'm just showing you how you can compute a market equilibrium if you know the shape of your demand curve and the shape of your supply curve. And this is the graphical representation of this market equilibrium. Okay, well, I feel like so far, so good. Should not be too complicated. Next chapter or next part in this PPT is to understand the concepts of shortage or excess demand and surplus or excess supply, which is simply something that happens whenever the market is not in equilibrium. Whenever you have a market that is in disequilibrium, it's either that the price is too high or too low. By too high, I mean larger than its equilibrium level, and too low, I mean lower than the equilibrium level. If it's too high, so if the price P is larger than P star, so P star is the equilibrium price, okay? So if the price is too high, then yes, we have a situation where basically firms want to sell more than what buyers want to buy. Okay, so the quantity supplied is larger than the quantity demanded. And the gap between the two is what we call an excess supply. Okay, we have a greater quantity supplied than a quantity demanded. So if you calculate the difference, we have something that we call excess supply or surplus. And sorry, I need to plug my computer, otherwise I'll be out of battery. Okay, let me just check. Yes, all good. And if the price is too low, so it's the opposite in this case. The quantity demanded is going to be larger than the quantity supplied, which basically means that buyers want to buy more than what sellers have to offer or want to offer. Of course, I say want because it's a shortcut, but it's always are willing and able. Okay, so it's not sufficient to want to buy or to want to sell. You must also be able to, of course. So if the price is too low, the gap between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded is what we call excess demand or shortage. All right, no, not very complicated. Now, what is a bit more interesting is to understand the process that is going to help the market to get back to equilibrium whenever we have a shortage or whenever we have a surplus or a shortage. Because we often say, yes, if we have a shortage, the price will go up. Oh, okay. And if we have a surplus, the price will go down. Okay, but why? How does it work? And there are some essay questions where the students are expected to explain this process, what is gonna lead to a change in price, what is gonna bring the market back to equilibrium. It's important to understand that. And the answer is quite simple, and I'm gonna show you in both cases. The idea is that whenever the market is in disequilibrium, buyers and sellers, they will be encouraged to have a certain behavior, and it is that behavior that is going to take the price up when there is a shortage, and to take the price down when there is a surplus. So let's focus on a shortage. So if we have a shortage, this means that the price is too low. So why is it gonna go back up to restore the market equilibrium? Well, in that case, you have a situation where there is not enough output for all buyers. Okay, perhaps we have 10 loaves of bread and we have 20 consumers who want to buy one each. That's exactly a shortage. Well, if you really want to have a loaf of bread, you know that you are actually competing with the other buyers. Okay, they are, in this case, there's not enough for everyone. So if you really want one loaf of bread, and if you want to make sure that the seller will sell you a loaf of bread and not to the other consumers, or not to the other people who actually want to buy a loaf of bread, you need to convince the seller that you are the right buyer. And how do you convince the seller to sell to you and not to sell to the other buyers? Well, you can simply offer a higher price. Okay, so if the seller sells each loaf of bread for $2, you can say, hey, look, well, $2, it's not much. I can give you $2.5. Okay, I'm happy to give you $2.5, and you can sell it to me and not to the other buyers. Another example that I often give is sometimes if you really want to rent an apartment, depending on the city in which you want to live in, it might actually be quite difficult to find an apartment, simply because, yeah, there are not so many apartments available. And anytime you you visit an apartment, unfortunately, there are 5, 6, 10 other potential tenants that visit the same apartment at the same time. If you visit an apartment in Paris, for example, this is what is going to happen. So in this case, if you really want the apartment, and the landlord asks, let's say, 1,000 euros for the apartment, and you know that there are 10 other potential tenants, well, what you can do is just to offer a higher price. You can say, oh, I really like this place. How much do you ask? Oh, 1,000 euros. Well, what if I give you 1,100 euros? Okay, so you rent it to me, not to the other potential tenants. So that's the idea. Okay, that's why on the one hand, buyers, when there is a shortage, if they really want the product, if they don't want to be left with nothing, they have an incentive to offer a higher price to outbid the other buyers and to find a seller that is going to trade with them. So that's the behavior that buyers are encouraged to adopt. How about sellers? Well, in this case, if you are a seller and if you see that at the market price, so at the price that you at which you currently sell your output, that there are more people who want to buy than what you have available, well, that just means that, yeah, okay, so I can raise the price. Okay, I can raise the price until the quantity that I am willing to sell at that price is equal to the quantity that people are willing to pay. Okay, the quantity that people are willing to buy at that price. If I sell each loaf of bread at $2, and at that price, I am willing to produce 10, and I see that the quantity demanded is 20. Okay, what information do I receive? Well, basically, I can raise the price And this way, I am encouraged to do it due to the profit incentive. Of course, if I increase the price, I will be able to make more profit. Okay, so in this case, yes, the sellers have the upper hand in the market. So buyers are encouraged to offer a higher price to outbid other buyers, and sellers, they realize that, oh, perhaps the price is too low. If I increase the price, I can make more money and I will still be able to sell as much as I want. So that's why the price is going to increase until it reaches its equilibrium level. What if we have the opposite? What if we have an excess supply? So in this case, it's the opposite. The quantity supplied is larger than the quantity demanded. So sellers want to sell a larger quantity that buyers want to buy. So in this case, buyers, they have the upper hand, which means that they have more bargaining power. That's what I mean. They have more bargaining power in the market because they essentially see that there are a lot of sellers who struggle to sell their output. They have produced some output and it's difficult for them to sell it. So it's likely that their stocks will increase. And therefore, this gives buyers an advantage in this market. And they can just say, all right, so you want to sell this output to me? Yeah, okay, no problem. But how much do you ask? You ask $20? No, I'll buy it from you at $18, something like that. A typical example of excess supply can be in the labor market. Because in the labor market, who buys or who demands labor? Businesses. And who sells, who supplies labor? The workers. So having an excess supply or surplus in the labor market simply means that you have a form of unemployment. And you know that from A2 that this is a type of unemployment that we call real wage or classical unemployment. So let's say that you are a business and you are looking for a new accountant, okay? So you list a job offer on the website. Okay, and you say, okay, I am looking for a new accountant for $2,000 per month. Okay, so basically the quantity supplied, the quantity demanded is 1. At $2,000, the firm demands 1 worker. Okay, and you receive 5 applications. So there are 5 accountants who are willing and able to sell their workforce to you if you offer a salary of $2,000. Well, that's clearly an example of excess supply. At $2,000, you want to buy 1 worker, to hire 1 worker, and the quantity supplied is 5. So in that case, the sellers are actually competing to sell their workforce, in my example, to you. And what you realize is as a seller, what you realize as a business, so you demand labor, is that $2,000 might actually be too much. If at $2,000 you have 5 people who want to work for you, perhaps you could offer less, okay? And this would reduce your cost of production. So you can offer less until the quantity supplied is equal to 1, unless you only have 1 accountant willing and able to work for you at that price. So basically the point is that buyers, they realize that essentially the price is too high and they can simply offer a lower price. That's the idea. So yes, buyers have the upper hand in the market because sellers compete for buyers and they can offer a lower price. How about sellers? Well, sellers, that's the same idea. The problem is that they are competing. There are many sellers and not many buyers in this market. So if they really want to find the buyer, if they really want to sell their good or service, they need to charge a lower price. Okay, something like a worker that would say, all right, at $2,000 there are 5 people who want the job, so maybe if I say that I am ready to accept a lower price, maybe if I say that I am willing to accept only $1,800 a month, well, then this will encourage the business to give me the job and not to give it to the other potential accountants or the other potential workers. So in that case, sellers, they really want to sell their output, their good or service. This might be because they want to clear their stocks, because of course holding stocks can be expensive. So they have an incentive to charge a lower price to basically undercut the other sellers. So in the case of a shortage, buyers have an incentive to offer a higher price to outbid the other buyers. And in the case of an excess supply, sellers have an incentive to charge a lower price to undercut the other sellers and make sure that they find the buyer, that they are able to find the buyer so they can poach business from the other potential suppliers. So that's the idea. And it's important to understand that this is the process through which the market will get back to equilibrium whenever the price is too high or is too low. So it's important that your students can explain what happens, what are the incentives of buyers, should they offer more, should they offer less, and what are the incentives of sellers. Can they charge a higher price? And should they charge a lower price? All right. Then that's how we can represent it, but that should not be very complicated. That's the surplus, you know that. So the price will go down. I explained the process to eliminate that surplus. This is the case of a shortage. The price is too low and the price will go up to eliminate that shortage until the market price reaches its equilibrium position. Should not be too complicated. So far, so good. Any questions up to now? Or are we ready to move on? Okay. Right, let's talk about the price mechanism. So it's actually a pretty simple idea. But the problem is that in textbooks, it's often very unclear. So I'm going to try to make it as clear and straightforward as possible. So what is it? Let's start with a definition. Price mechanism is the way in which the market forces of supply and demand, which are driven by what people want to buy and what firms want to sell, essentially, will interact, determine a price. Okay, supply demand, boom, when the market is in equilibrium, we have the equilibrium price. And that price is what is going to determine resource allocation. This is what is going to determine how many resources firms allocate to production. That's the price mechanism. And of course, this relates to the basic economic problem. Remember that the basic economic problem is essentially we don't have enough resources, resources are scarce, and therefore we have to decide what to do with them. We have to decide how many resources to allocate to the production of each good and service. And the price mechanism is a system that determines this resource allocation, that solves, if you want, this resource allocation problem by determining, okay, how much resources will be allocated to the production of each good and service. And remember when we said that if we want to solve the basic economic problem, there are three questions that must be answered: what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. So the price mechanism will tell you what to produce, what goods and services, and in what quantity. The price mechanism will also tell you how to produce, because of course, the price mechanism will determine the price of resources. And the price of resources will help you choose whether you want your production to be more labor intensive or more capital intensive. And of course, the price mechanism will also tell you for whom to produce, simply because we'll see that in a minute, but the price mechanism has a rationing function. And who is going to consume? Only those who have a high enough willingness to pay. So the price mechanism is essentially something that will provide an answer to each of those three fundamental questions. So that's one way you can solve the basic economic problem. And this is the mechanism through which an economy will allocate resources, and not any kind of economy, but a free market economy. Okay, so in a free market economy, the price mechanism is essentially the system that allocates resources between competing users. Okay, and there are three functions. Yes, three functions: the signaling function, the rationing function, and the incentive function. But before we talk about those three functions, I'd like to show you, actually, I should move it. Let's move it because I think it would be better to put it just there. I'll change things a little bit. Yeah, so there is a very simple way. There is a very simple way to illustrate that. Okay, so remember, we have to decide how many resources to allocate to production. That's one of the key questions that we have to answer. Okay. Of course, how many resources to allocate to production depends on how much we want to produce. If we want to produce a large output, we need to allocate a lot of resources. If we want to produce a low output, we need to allocate just a few resources. That's very simple. So essentially what I'm saying is that this depends on the equilibrium quantity. Okay. And the equilibrium quantity depends on the market price, or especially, or in particular, the quantity that we are going to produce in the market depends on what the market price is. All right. If the market price is very, very high, we will not produce a lot because there will be a very big surplus. The quantity demanded is going to be very low. If we decrease the price, the quantity demanded will, so the equilibrium quantity or the quantity traded will increase. Okay, the surplus will become smaller. Then once we reach the equilibrium quantity, once we reach the equilibrium price, the quantity traded will be maximized. And then if we keep decreasing the price below the equilibrium price, we will start to have a shortage and the quantity traded will start to fall again. In that case, simply because the sellers are not interested in selling a large output because the price is too low. Okay, so basically keep this in mind. How many resources to allocate depends on how much we want to produce, and how much we want to produce depends on the price in the market. And the price in the market depends on supply and demand. Okay, it is the interaction of supply and demand that determines the market price. And that's it. Too easy. That's what we call essentially the price mechanism. So it clearly shows how supply and demand will determine the market price, that will determine how much we want to produce, and therefore determine or tell firms how many resources they should allocate to production. So, if we want to look at things in a bit more, in more detail, we have to look at the three functions of the price mechanism. And it is something that is a bit tricky, not because it's complicated, but because if you take different books or different sources, they will tell you very different things that sometimes don't make much sense, honestly. So let's try to keep it simple. The first function, the signaling function, is all about information. A signal is an information. That's it. So the idea behind the signaling function of the price mechanism is simply that prices give information to buyers and sellers. That's it. If you are a consumer and if you see that the price is very high, it gives you an information, oh, this is expensive. So basically, and this tells you, if I choose to buy this product, there are many other products that I will not be able to buy. Okay, if the price is high, and if I choose to buy that product, then the opportunity cost is extremely high. And on the other hand, if the price is low, this gives me an information. This product is cheap, So the opportunity cost of consuming that product is pretty low. You will not have to give up much if you choose to buy this product. That's an information. And that's the same thing for sellers, but of course, it's not about whether it's costly to buy. It's about whether it is valuable to sell. If a business or a firm sees that, oh, the price of this product is very high, this signals, this gives the information that this product is valuable to produce and sell. Okay, producing this product will enable me to make a lot of money, to keep things very simple. And on the other hand, if a market price is very low, this gives an information to sellers that this production is not very profitable because the output is not very valuable in the market. And why is this very important? Because this signaling function is very important simply because if you want to make good economic decisions as an individual or as a firm, you need information. You need to be able to compare the different value of goods and services, so you can choose which ones you should buy and which ones you should not buy. And as a seller, same thing, you need to be able to compare the value of various goods and services so you can choose which ones to produce and which one not to produce. So that's basically what we mean by the signaling function of the price mechanism. Just like when we talk about money, we said that money is a unit of account, that it enables us to compare the value of things and make good economic decision. It's the signaling function is very closely related to that. Prices give information about the cost and the value of goods and services, and this information is the basis for economic decision making. All right, so that's it. Prices convey information to both buyers and sellers. Yes. Information is what allows buyers and sellers to make the best possible economic decision. If you don't know what the price of something is, how do you know how much to buy? How do you know how much to sell? Impossible. And basically, if you see that, well, the price of something increases, it sends different messages to buyers and sellers. So for buyers, it tells them, hey, it's more costly. Okay, so that's the information that buyers receive. So higher opportunity cost. And for sellers, the information is it's more valuable. Okay, so basically you could make more money by producing this product. And the decrease in price, again, are going to send different messages to buyers and sellers. The message to sellers will be this product has become less valuable. And the message to buyers is this product has become less costly. And again, the signaling function is not about what buyers and sellers should do. It's only about what information they receive. You should really see that as a process. Okay, first you receive an information, and then you use that information to choose what to do. Okay, just like when you are in a meeting, first you talk, you share information, and then you use that information to decide what to do. All right, that's exactly the same thing with the price mechanism. The signaling function is just about messages sent to buyers and sellers. Okay, the two other functions are more about, okay, now we have the information about the relative cost and value of goods and services. What should we do? All right, let's skip that. For buyers, the consequence, if you want, of that information, or the next step, is described by the rationing function. The rationing function of the price mechanism is extremely simple. It just tells you, well, only because of things are, if you want to buy something, you need to pay the price of that product. This means that only those buyers with a high enough willingness to pay will be able to get the product. That's it. Consumption will be restricted to those who have a high enough willingness to pay. Okay. So for any given market price, you will have buyers who purchase the product because their willingness to pay is higher than the market price, and you have buyers who do not get the product because their willingness to pay is less than the market price. Okay, and that's this rationing function, which if you don't like rationing, you can replace it by restricting. Okay, it's simply the process by which the higher the price, the less the quantity demanded. That's it. The higher price, the fewer consumers will be willing and able to purchase the product. That's simply the rationing function. And actually, when you think about it, it is just the law of demand. That's it. That's the law of demand. An increase in price leads to a decrease in quantity demanded. A decrease in price leads to an increase in the quantity demanded. It is as simple as that. So when you think about rationing, just remember, yes, that's just the law of demand. A high price will restrict, there will be more rationing. That's how you can put it. If you increase the price, more rationing. If you decrease the price, less rationing. Less rationing means more people can actually purchase the product. More rationing means fewer people can actually purchase the product. Okay. So again, the rationing function really is about what happens to the quantity demanded when the price changes. And the incentive function is about what happens to the quantity supplied. So it's really what happens for sellers when the price is high or when the price is low, when the price increases or decreases. And as you can guess, the rationing function really relates to the law of demand, and the incentive function relates to the law of supply. That's it. If something has a very high price, if a product is sold at a very high price, then firms are encouraged to produce a lot. And if a product has a very low market price, firms are not encouraged to produce a lot. That's it. So what we call the incentive function of the price mechanism simply means that prices encourage firms to allocate resources to the production of goods and services. And the higher the price, the more firms are able and willing to produce. That's the law of supply. And therefore, the more resources should be allocated to the production of that good. Okay. So if you increase the price, there are more incentives. So a stronger incentive function of the price mechanism, more quantity supplied. But if there is a decrease in price, the incentive function becomes weaker. There is less incentive to produce. That's it. So how can we actually represent this, or to show these three functions in a diagram? So let's start with a market in equilibrium. Okay, so D1S, equilibrium price P1, equilibrium quantity Q1. All right, and let's say that there is an increase in demand. Could be that it's a normal good and the income rises. Okay, well, we are not going to jump immediately to the new equilibrium. Okay, it takes time. It's not something instantaneous. So the price at first is still P1. Okay, but at P1, now there is a shortage because you see that the quantity supplied is Q1, but the quantity demanded is now QD. So the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, so there is an excess demand. And as I explained earlier, buyers, they will have an incentive to offer a higher price to outbid the other buyers. And firms, they see, hey, at that price, there are more people who want to buy my product than what I have to offer. So I can increase the price and I will make more money. So sellers have an incentive to charge a higher price. Buyers have an incentive to offer a higher price. So the price will go up. Okay, the price will go up. And yes, we will eventually reach the new equilibrium price P2 and the new equilibrium quantity Q2. But let's try to understand what happens within that process, during that process where the price increases. So buyers and sellers, they see that the price increases. So they receive an information. That's the signaling function of the price mechanism. So the message that buyers receive is, hey, this product is more expensive. So essentially the opportunity cost of buying this product is higher. That's the information received by buyers. The information received by sellers is, hey, this product has now become more valuable. Okay, good. Now, what is going to happen? What's going to be the consequence of that information? What are buyers and sellers going to do with that information? So we can look at the rationing function. We see that because the price is higher, the price increases from P1 to P2. So the rationing function will become stronger. Okay, there will be more rationing, which means that there will be fewer consumers willing and able to purchase the product. Okay, so this is represented by a movement up along the demand curve, decrease in quantity demanded, more rationing. And on the other hand, sellers, they have an incentive to produce more because the price is higher. Okay, so the price is higher. So firms, according to the law of supply, they have an incentive. They have more incentive to produce this product, and this is represented by an increase in the quantity supplied. And you see that the combination of this more rationing and more incentive will eliminate the shortage, simply because, remember, what is a shortage? Too many buyers, not enough sellers. Rationing means we have fewer buyers, and incentive, we have more sellers. So eventually the combination of these two effects will effectively eliminate the shortage and bring the market back to a new equilibrium. We can do it the other way around. What if demand decreases? Okay, so same thing. We are not going to move immediately to the new equilibrium price. First, we will be stuck at P1. And at P1, you see that we have an excess supply. The quantity demanded is QD. The quantity supplied is Q1. Quantity supplied is larger than quantity demanded. Okay, so same thing. In that case, what happens? The buyers, they have the upper hand in the market because there are too many sellers and not enough buyers in this market. So they can simply offer a lower price to the sellers. And the sellers, they might want to clear their stock, so they compete for buyers, and they have an incentive to charge a lower price to undercut the other suppliers. So both the buyers and the sellers, they have an incentive to decrease the price, and eventually this mechanism is going to lead to the new market equilibrium, P2. Okay, and the new equilibrium quantity, Q2. All right, so now let's try again to identify the three functions of the price mechanism in this example. So when the price decreases from P1 to P2, first, the signaling function of the price mechanism is going to send messages to buyers and sellers. So the message to sellers is this product is less valuable. Okay, it's just an information. And the message to buyers is this product is less costly. Okay, just an information. Then what are buyers and sellers going to do with this information? So consumers, they receive the information, this product is cheaper, is less costly, which means that, oh, now we can buy more. That's the law of demand, lower price, higher quantity demanded, which means less rationing. Okay, the rationing function becomes weaker because of the lower price. Okay, the higher the price, the stronger the rationing, the lower the price, the weaker the rationing function. So there is less rationing, and this is represented by a movement down along the demand curve, an increase in the quantity of demanded, an extension of demand. Sellers, they have received the information, hey, this product is not as valuable as before. Consequence or decision, we should sell less or we should supply less. That's the incentive function of the price mechanism. The lower price leads to a lower quantity supplied, again, according to the law of supply, because there is less incentive to produce due to the lower price. And this is represented by a movement down along the supply curve, a contraction of supply. And you see that, again, the combination of having less incentive and less rationing will eliminate the surplus. Again, surplus, we have more sellers than buyers, but less incentives means fewer sellers. and less rationing means more buyers. So at the end of the day, the surplus will be eliminated and the market will clear at a price of P2. Okay. So I feel like this explanation, this way of approaching the functions of the price mechanism is just easy to understand. But again, it varies a lot from one source to the other, especially about the signaling function of the price mechanism. I think the best way to make it clear to your students is really to emphasize that a price signal is just an information. It's not a decision in itself, okay? An information does not change your behavior in itself. It's just something that you will use to change your behavior. And of course, buyers, they will use that information to change how much they buy. That's the rationing function. Sellers, they will use that information, that signal, to change the quantity that they sell. That's the incentive function. So there is a link between the signaling function and the other function. But you can say something like the signaling function comes first. Okay, first we receive the information, and then the incentive and rationing function of the price mechanism, they come next. They are simply the response of buyers and sellers to this new information that they receive. And I also feel like the clearest way to explain the incentive function and the rationing function is really to explain that the incentive function is for sellers. More incentive, because of a higher price, you sell more. Less incentive because of a lower price, you sell less. That's the law of supply. And rationing function, this is for the buyers. This relates to the law of demand. Higher price, more rationing, you buy less. Lower price, less rationing, you buy more. And to me, that's clear, easy to understand, easy to explain, easy to illustrate. What do you think? Does it make sense to you? After a few years of teaching this topic, I feel like that's the best approach. Any questions about that, about the price mechanism? Yeah, I feel like it makes sense. I hope it will make sense to your students as well. But again, the problem for this type of things is that, again, it's just a matter of definitions, right? If somebody wants to give another definition for the signaling function of the incentive function, it's not right, it's not wrong, it's just a definition. But then, as I often say, there are definitions that make sense, that are easy to understand, and there are definitions that are more weird. So I feel like the definitions that I use make sense and they are easy to remember. Okay, last thing about the invisible hand. So on this slide, you have a very rare photograph of the invisible hand. Beautiful, isn't it? So what is it? And actually, in the Cambridge curriculum, it's not very clear, because they basically say that the invisible hand is the price mechanism, but it's a bit weird, right? So, and the reason for which I have not yet uploaded this PPT on the website is because I want to modify this slide slightly, so you will have it very, very soon. Basically, the invisible hand, so it's not the real hand, of course. It's what we call a metaphor. So it's just like not really a symbol, but an image. Okay, it's an image, and it just describes something that had been observed by Adam Smith, and actually many people believe that he first used this expression in The Wealth of Nations, but he actually used it before. in another book. I forgot the name, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, I believe. But he uses this term in another context. I think he uses the term the invisible hand of Jupiter in The Theory of Moral Sentiments. In the Wealth of Nations that was published in 1776, that's one of the only dates I remember for economic history. The idea is simply that he noticed that people in an economy, they make self-interested decisions. They care about themselves when they choose what to buy, when they choose what to sell. And that's often the assumption that we make in economics. Okay, they are self-interested individuals. But the outcome of those self-interested decisions, they produce benefits, unintended benefits, but benefits for society overall. Okay, so basically, to put it simply, what I do it for me, and it's good for me, but at the same time, it's also good for the rest of society, even if this is not what I intended. So how to make sense out of it? And I will update this particular slide a little bit to give more examples. But a business that, or let's say if you go to the cinema and you are a student, then you might receive a discount. Yeah, that's what we call price discrimination. But do you think the cinema offers a discount because it cares about you? Say, oh, poor student, you don't have a lot of money, so you might not be able to watch this amazing movie. Oh, this is so sad, so I'm gonna offer you 20% discount so you can watch this movie. We often say that firms are not benevolent, which means that they don't make decisions because they generally care about the welfare of their customers. The reasons, and you know that since because you studied price discrimination, that the reason for which sometimes businesses, they offer a lower price to some groups of customers, that's simply because they can make more money, they can increase their profit. So offering the lowest possible price is, firms do not decrease the price of their product because they are kind, because they care about customers and because they want to make sure that everybody can buy their product, but simply because they know that this is one way they can sell more, especially if there is a tough competition. If you reduce the price of your output, you might gain market shares and make more profit. So that's good for you if you decrease the price as a business, you make more profit. But at the same time, of course, it's also good for customers because they can buy the product at a lower price. So they benefit from the fact that you sell your output at a lower price, even though this is not really what matters to the organization. Whether the consumers are happier because there is a lower price, they don't really care. But they simply care about, okay, do I make more profit, yes or no? And that's the same thing with product quality. Businesses, they will not care about offering the highest product quality. I mean, they will not produce the highest quality or offer the highest quality because they are generally interested in making sure they don't really care whether consumers, they can keep the products for a long time, or that the user experience will be as enjoyable as possible. They care about quality because they know that this is one way they can increase the price, that this is one way they can increase their profit margin, that this is one way they can differentiate their products. So that's the idea. Businesses that offer high quality products, they don't do it for the customers. They do it for themselves. But of course, as a consumer, being able to buy products of high quality is definitely beneficial to you. One example that I have in mind is the baby formula. As a young father, I'm very, very happy that there are some companies that offer very high quality baby formula. That's great. That I definitely benefit from this. But I know that the company that produces and sells this product doesn't really care about me, just cares about my money, right? Uh, so that's really the idea of the invisible hand, that especially businesses will make decisions that are guided by the profit motive. But at the end of the day, this is gonna generate very widespread benefit for the entire society, not only for themselves, but for all the participants in the economy. Same thing for product differentiation. Consumers, as a consumer, it's great if you have plenty of choice. It's much better than if you could only buy one type of car. Can you imagine if if all car companies produced exactly the same car? Well, you would not have a lot of choice, which means that you might be stuck in a situation where the model of car that you have to purchase doesn't really matches your preferences. Perhaps you want a small electric car, but the only car available is a big traditional petrol car. Okay. So it's great when you are in a market where there are many types of different products, but businesses, they do not differentiate their product, and they do not try to bring into the market something new, something different, something that can match your preferences, because they care about you and the fact that, oh, it's great if this consumer can find a product that very precisely match his or her preferences. But they know that this is one way to gain market shares and eventually to make more profit. So that really is what the invisible hand is about. Economic agents, if you let them do whatever they want, if they can trade with no restrictions, if sellers, they can sell whatever they want, if buyers, they can buy whatever they want, this will lead to a situation that is good for everyone, simply because self-interested decisions will create benefits for everyone. So yes, it was mentioned, it was used at least once in The Wealth of Nations, but not only. And the consequence is that, well, we don't really need government intervention, because even if firms are self-interested, even if they care about profit, what they will do will result in a good outcome for everyone. It will generate plenty of benefits for the entire society. So there is no reason to regulate the economy. There is no reason for the government to interfere with the economic decisions of businesses and individuals. So of course, this works as long as you don't have market failures. And this works as long as you do not care about income inequalities. If the market fails, then the invisible hand will not work very well, and it might lead or guide the economy towards an outcome that might have very big income inequalities. So that's also two limitations of the invisible hand: market failures and income inequalities. But yeah, Adam Smith was well often seen as an advocate of what we call laissez-faire policies. Laissez-faire means let do. So let do means just let people buy whatever they want to buy and let businesses sell whatever they want to sell. There is no need for government intervention, because in any event, even if people make selfish decisions, their selfish decisions will generate benefit for everyone. That's the idea behind the invisible hand. So that's why I feel like just saying the invisible hand is the price mechanism, not very precise. Okay, and the last part is very simple. So I'm just going to take a few minutes on this. What happens if you increase demand or supply? What happens to the equilibrium quantity? What happens to the equilibrium price? So it's very easy. What happens when you change supply, increase or decrease? What happens when you change demand? So what I mean, what happens is what happens to the equilibrium quantity, what happens to the equilibrium price. This is represented by a movement along the demand curve, along the supply curve. What if you change both? So the problem when you change both supply and demand is that there will always be something whose change is going to be ambiguous. Could be a change in the equilibrium quantity. You might not know if it's going to increase or decrease. Or there could be ambiguity on the equilibrium price or quantity or price. You might not know if it increases or decreases. Depends on basically which shift is the largest. So I have considered all cases here, and I have summarized in this table so you can fill it with your students because in the student version, the table is empty or will be empty. You will be able to download it very shortly. So you have all cases. So an arrow that goes up means increase. An arrow that goes down means decrease. And an arrow that goes horizontally to the right means is unchanged. Okay, so that might be a bit tricky because it doesn't mean that it shifts right. It means it remains constant. Okay, so it's unchanged. So if you want to replace it by something else, so there is no confusion, feel free to do so. Okay, and then of course, P star is what happens to the equilibrium price. Does it go up or down? What happens to the equilibrium quantity? Does it go up or down? And the question marks, they show the situation where it can either go up or go down, depending on which shift is the largest. And if I remember well, some students, they actually found a way to figure out what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity when you change both demand and supply, simply looking at what happens when you change just one. So for example, here you see what happens if we increase supply and if we increase demand. The answer is that the change in the equilibrium price is uncertain, and the change in the equilibrium quantity is positive, so the equilibrium quantity will rise. But what you can see is that this is the combination of these two changes, increase in supply and increase in demand, okay? And it's clear that the quantity increases in both cases, so overall the quantity increases, but you see that in one case, if you increase supply, the price decreases. If you increase demand, the price increases. So the combination of the two is uncertain. Other example, so if we decrease both supply and demand, so this is the combination of these two cases. In both cases, the quantity, the equilibrium quantity falls. So there is no ambiguity. The combination of both will lead to a decrease in the equilibrium quantity. But again, you see that a decrease in supply leads to an increase in price, a decrease in demand leads to a decrease in price. So the combination of the two changes is unclear. And you can do that for all cases, just combining the different scenarios, just to find out what's going to happen to the equilibrium price or the equilibrium quantity. Yeah, and actually, yeah, I don't know if this is something that is commonly used, but I never really found it in textbooks. Just some students told me that this can work this way, and I felt like this was a great idea, and I decided to include it in my presentations. So then the rest of the PPT is essentially a series of diagrams that consider all possible cases. Yes, it took a long time. So I'm not going to talk about all this because it's like super easy, right? But I have considered all the possible cases: increase in supply, decrease in supply, increase in demand, decrease in demand, blah, blah, blah. So you have all the possible cases. And whenever there is an outcome that can be ambiguous, that can lead to either an increase or a decrease in price, or either to an increase or decrease in the equilibrium quantity, I have represented both cases. So you really have all the cases. That's a lot. if you look at, let me just share my screen to show you if I show you the summary, so same thing, the summary will be shared very quickly, blah, 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 market equilibrium summary, it's there. Yes. So you have all the cases here. Yeah, all cases. So how many? 4, yeah, 12 cases. Sorry. So you have 12 cases, but this should not be very complicated. It's relatively straightforward. But of course, what I usually do is I ask my students to do the diagrams themselves. Instead of doing all the job on my own, I just assign different cases to different students. So there are 12 possible cases. So you can just assign each one diagram to one student. They can do that on the whiteboard, like several at the same time. You can just tell them, okay, what happens if we increase demand and increase supply, blah, blah, blah. And just to make sure that they get it right. And then at the end, there is one exercise where we look at the market for ham, and I consider 3 possible changes: an increase in the price of eggs, a substitute in consumption, could be a complement, but I assume that it is a substitute because both ham and eggs are a source of protein. So what happens? Of course, it's going to shift demand. It's going to increase the demand for ham. An increase in the price of pig feed. So pig feed is what we give to the pigs. So it's an input in the production. It's the price of an input in the production of ham. And therefore, it means that ham production has become more costly. So this is going to lead to a decrease in supply. And then you have 2 changes at the same time. That's the last case. An increase in the price of pig feed, so it's going to decrease supply. An increase in the price of eggs is going to increase the demand for ham. And of course, at the end of the day, the equilibrium quantity, the price will go up for sure, but the equilibrium quantity could either go up or down. So there are 2 cases to consider. So that's case 1, where you see that the quantity increases. That's one possibility. And there is another case where you see that the quantity actually decreases. It's another possible case. Okay. And that's it for market equilibrium. Any questions? I'm going to get more water. Please type your questions if you have any, and I will be back in 2 minutes. All right. Yes, Mitchell, the PPT will be shared later on the website. Again, I just want to, the last thing that I want to do is just to make a very small change on the invisible hand. I want to give some examples, just like the examples that I gave orally today. I want to write a few sentences about it just to illustrate how it actually works. Once it's done, everything else is ready. The summary is ready. The PPT is ready. The concept cards, everything is ready. I just want to make this minor modification before uploading it. So it should be there tomorrow. You should have it really, really soon. Okay. So if there are no more questions about these topic, we can move on and have a look at the next one, interrelationships between markets. And this one is very easy, and actually it's mostly a summary of what we have already studied when looking at supply and when looking at demand, because we will look at substitutes and complements in production or consumption, which is something that we already discussed when talking about supply and demand. The only two new concepts that we will introduce, these are the concepts of derived demand and composite. I don't really know how to pronounce this properly, composite demand. These two concepts are new. We have not introduced them before. So, all right. So there are 6 primary interrelationships that the students must know. Competitive demand, which are simply the substitutes in consumption. Okay. Joint demand, the complements in consumption. Okay, things that you need to. So competitive demand is one can replace the other. Joint demand is when you need to buy them together. And derived demand, so this one is new, is when you buy one input to produce a certain output. Composite demand is when there is one product that can be demanded for multiple purposes. Competitive supply, substitute in production, when with the same resources you can produce either one output or another. Joint supply, complements of production, when two products are produced at the same time with the same resources. Okay. So feel free to briefly introduce what this is about before giving more details. And the only thing that I'm going to do in this PPT is just to define what each relationship is about, to give an example or several examples, and then to look at side-by-side diagrams to see, okay, if something happens in one market, what's going to happen in the other markets. Easy. So let's start with competitive demand. So of course, here we have planes and or air transportation and rail transportation, which are not always substitutes. Okay, if I want to go to Australia from China, maybe not the best substitute, but if I want to go from Chengdu to Xi'an, yeah, then they could really be regarded as two substitutes in consumption. First, you can just make sure that students understand how to use this verb, because it might be a bit tricky. We often say substitute one good for the other, and sometimes it might be a bit unclear what it means. So I usually start with this. If you substitute good X for good Y, do you get more X and less Y, or do you get more Y and less X? Okay, just to make sure that they understand what it means to substitute one good for the other. Okay? And if you substitute good X for good Y, it means that you replace good Y by good X. Okay, so if you substitute good X for good Y, you get more of X and less of Y. You replace Y by X. Okay, so the students should make sure that they know how to use this verb properly, not the other way around. So yeah, if you initially have 5 rabbits and 40 berries, and if you substitute 1 rabbit for 20 berry, okay, then you end up with 6 rabbits and 20 berries. So you have more rabbits and fewer berries. Okay, maybe not super important, but it's always good to make sure that they know how to use this verb properly. All right, so we've already said that, so it's mostly a summary from demand. We say that two goods, X and Y, they are in competitive demand, or we sometimes say that they are substitutes in consumption if you can simply replace one by the other. It doesn't mean that they are identical, just mean that they are similar enough so their consumption can serve the same purpose, okay? But in most cases, substitutes are imperfect substitute. Train and plane, okay? They are two things you can use to go from one point to the other, but they are not perfect substitute. They are not completely identical. So yeah, typical examples, tea and coffee, train and plane, blue pen and black pen, and so on and so on. So now the last thing is, if you have two goods in competitive demand, if you increase the price of one, what happens to the demand for the other? So we've already talked about this when discussing the determinants of demand. And we've also talked about this when looking at the cross price elasticity of demand. So this should really be a summary. So if you increase the price of one, the demand for the other will increase. Okay, if you increase the price of good Y, you buy less Y, and instead you buy more of X. And if you decrease the price of good Y, then you can buy more of good Y, and therefore you will buy less of X. Yes, and this is how you can represent it. So yes, I actually, you know that I like to have those diagrams built step by step. So because to me, this is really a story. If you just show the diagram like this right away, it's a bit scary and oh wow, there's just too much information right away. So I like to start from like an empty diagram, and then I can tell my story. Okay, let me just to give you an example of how I do it with the students. All right, so this is the market for tea, so quantity and price of tea, and this is the initial market equilibrium, a quantity P1, quantity Q1 and price P1, and this is the market for coffee with the initial equilibrium, price P1 and quantity Q1. Now let's just assume that for some reason, doesn't matter, perhaps this is an increase in the in wages of people who produce tea. Maybe this is the increase in the price of an input. It doesn't matter. Let's just say that the supply of tea decreases, could be because of the bad weather, for example. So as a result, we see that there will be an increase in the price of tea from P1 to P2 and a decrease in the quantity. So because the price of tea has increased, we see that the quantity demanded decreases. People drink less tea. And what's going to happen in the market for coffee? Because people drink less tea, instead they will drink more coffee, which is represented by a rightward shift of demand. You see, I like to go step by step just to be able to tell my story. If I see that, if I show that right away, it's more difficult to understand the logic and the different stages of the reasoning. Okay, and of course, you have the other way around. If supply increases, the price decreases, people buy more tea, and therefore people buy less coffee. And you can even show what's going to be the consequence in terms of the equilibrium price and quantity of coffee. Because yes, in all cases, I considered what happens when the price increases and decreases. All right, but I think that's okay, because that's just a summary. Joint demand, what we have here, we have sugar, coffee, whiskey. I don't know what's behind. And yeah, well, mostly sugar and coffee. That's why I included that picture. Yeah, if you put your whiskey in your coffee, I think we call it an Irish coffee, right? Joint demand, you need to buy them together. This does not mean that you always have to, like sugar and coffee in most cases, even if you don't have sugar, you can still drink your coffee. This just usually means that it's better if you have them together. It depends, because sometimes if you have like a car but no gas, or if you have a razor and no blades, or a toothbrush but no toothpaste, then well, that's really a problem. And you know that this has an influence on the value of the cross price elasticity of demand. But yeah, joint demand, they must be consumed together. Some examples: sugar and coffee, ink and printers, video games and consoles. You can multiply the examples, of course. And of course, here it's the opposite reasoning. If X becomes more expensive, you buy less of X, and because you have less of X, you need less of Y, so the demand for Y will decrease. If the price of X decreases, you will buy more of X, and you will also need to buy more of Y because the two goods, they go together, essentially. And again, you can show that graphically. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it's pretty easy to explain. So here, for example, printers and ink. So the supply of printers decreases, so the price rises, so people buy fewer printers. And because they buy fewer printers, they do not need to buy as much ink as before. This is represented by a decrease in demand, leading to a decrease in both the equilibrium price and quantity of ink. And the second pair of diagrams show the other way around: increase in supply of printers, lower price, higher quantity, people buy more printers, and therefore they also need to buy more ink, which is represented by an increase in the demand for ink, leading to an increase in both the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, pretty easy. Derived demand. So this one is new. This one is new, and of course this this example here, this picture is, well, quite useful to illustrate that the concept of derived demand, because yes, farmers, they buy a lot of capital equipment, including tractors and including those like this type of truck that we see on the left. We call that a combine harvester, which is a machine that is used for harvesting the crops. And you can ask your students, why do you think farmers buy this equipment? Why do you think they buy tractors? Why do you think they purchase combine harvesters? Why do you think they demand this capital equipment? And they will probably tell you, yeah, because they need that. They need that to produce, is this wheat? I think it looks like it. They need these machines to produce wheat. And then you can ask them, okay, but why do they want to produce wheat? And then they will say, yeah, simply because then they can sell it. And then final question, yeah, but how do you know they can sell it? And then they will tell you, yeah, because there are people who want to buy wheat. Okay, so, and you can now relate those two demands. There is a demand for tractors, there is a demand for combine harvesters, because there is a demand for wheat. Okay, so we can say that the demand for tractors, the demand for combine harvesters is derived. Being derived just means comes from, okay, or is driven by, comes from the demand for wheat. And that's really the relationship that we are interested in. Okay, so we say that the demand for good X is derived from the demand for good Y if good X is used as an input in the production of good Y. It is as simple as that. So generally speaking, the demand for the input is derived from the demand for the output. If nobody wanted to buy wheat, nobody would want to buy tractors, assuming farmers only produce wheat. Okay, so one demand comes from is the consequence of the other, if you want. It is because people want to buy wheat that farmers will buy tractors and combine harvesters. So examples, okay, so combine harvesters comes from the demand for wheat, the demand for physicians, doctors. Why do hospitals demand or hire doctors? Because there is a demand for healthcare, because people are willing to pay to go see a doctor, and that's why. Why is there a demand for kerosene, which is the fuel for planes? Because there is a demand for air travel. Okay, that's one is just the consequence, so it's derived from the other. So you can ask, of course, your students to give you more examples. The demand for steel is derived from the demand for cars. The demand for teachers is derived from the demand for education, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so then, of course, the idea here is that if we want to produce more of one good, then we must demand more of the input. It is as simple as that. So if there is an increase in the demand for good X, sorry, if Y is the output, if there is an increase in demand for good Y, the output, then there will be an increase in the demand for good X. Okay, simply because if the demand for the output increases, then we want to produce more. We'll see that on the diagrams, and therefore, if we want to produce more, we need more inputs. So the demand for the inputs will increase. However, if the demand for the output decreases, we'll see that in that case, we want to produce less. And therefore, if we want to produce less, the demand for the inputs will also decrease. Easy. So yeah, here I have steel and car. So of course, car is the output and steel is the input. So if the demand for cars increases, the equilibrium price rises and therefore we produce more. That's the incentive function of the price mechanism. So the equilibrium quantity rises in this case, and therefore if we want to produce more cars, we need to demand more steel. So the demand for steel will increase, making the price of steel higher and the equilibrium quantity also higher. And same thing, of course, if the demand for cars decreases, okay, so lower price for cars, low equilibrium quantity. So we want to produce less cars, and therefore we do not need to buy as much steel as before. So the demand for steel will decrease, leading to a fall in both the equilibrium price and quantity of steel. Okay, pretty straightforward. Now, this one, composite demand, is a bit different. It's essentially a situation where there is one product, mostly goods, not really services, one good, mostly raw materials, that can be used for several things, that can be demanded for several purposes, that can be demanded in multiple markets. I included that picture because you see there is a lot of wood in that picture. First, there is a floor. There is the furnitures. There is even some logs by the fire. My point here is that there are so many things you can do with wood. You could even do paper. You see there is like a book, so it's also wood. Books there as well. Probably the building itself probably has some wooden components. So yes, if you are a company who produces wood, you can actually sell it in two different markets. If your job is to cut trees, there are many different businesses in many different industries that might purchase your product. So there is like a multiple demand, or a demand that the same product is going to be demanded in many different markets. That's the idea. Okay, so that's how we define composite demand. So we say that good X is in composite demand if it is demanded in multiple markets, yes, for different purposes. So the examples that are used is like, yeah, timber, so like wood, essentially, steel. So of course, think about everything you can do with steel. Milk, yeah, same thing. There are so many things you can do with milk. You can make biscuits, you can make yogurts, you can make cakes, you can just drink it as such, so many things. And oil, of course, there are plenty of things you can do with oil, yes. So let's assume that you have one good X that is demanded in two markets. Okay, so market one, market two, one possible use, the other possible use. What if there is an increase in the demand for good X in one market? Well, in that case, what's going to happen is that the equilibrium price will increase in that market. So, which means that for sellers, it's going to be more profitable to sell good X in market one rather than in market two. Okay, I repeat, higher demand for good X in market one, higher equilibrium price, and therefore as a seller, now that the price of your product good X is relatively higher in market one, then you want to sell more of your product in market one rather than in market two, which means that the supply of good X in market two will decrease because you don't really want to sell in market two anymore because the price has become relatively lower. And it's the opposite. If there is a decrease, there are two A, sorry. If there is a decrease in the demand for good X in market one, the equilibrium price will be lower. So you have an incentive to sell less of good X in market one. And instead, you will have a stronger incentive to sell good X in market two, simply because it is relatively more attractive to sell your output good X in market two. So the supply of good X will increase in market two. So this is how it works. So here I looked at the example of timber, basically wood. So let's say that the demand for timber for furnitures increases, then of course, in that case, the equilibrium price rises and the equilibrium quantity goes up. But because firms who produce timber, they have a stronger incentive to sell timber in market one, timber for furnitures, there will be less wood available or less wood or timber left to be supplied in market two, timber for flooring. So the supply of timber in market two will decrease. Less incentive to sell timber wood in market two because now the price is relatively lower. Okay. What if the demand for timber for furnitures decreases? So the price decreases and therefore we want to supply less, quantity supply decreases in this market. And because we supply less in market one, that means that we will be more willing and able to supply in market two. So the price will, so the supply will eventually increase. Okay, that's about it. That's what we call composite demand, when one good can be demanded for multiple purposes. So therefore, in multiple markets. Two more things that we have already discussed, so that should be rather quick, the concept of competitive supply and joint supply. So here, I actually forgot what, so on the right, of course, we have corn. On the left is this soybeans. I'm not sure exactly, probably soybean. And these goods are in competitive supply because they essentially require the same resources. Okay, if you have a field, tractors, water, of course, and if you have some agricultural workers, you can produce either corn or soybeans. They require essentially the same resources. But of course, you cannot create both at the same time. Okay, it's one or the other. If you use more of your field to produce corn, you will have less of your field left to produce soybean, and vice versa. So that's why they are in competitive supply. You cannot produce more of them together. It's more of one is equal to less of the other. So that's how we define competitive supply properly. So there are substitutes, but in production. In this case, you can replace one by the other in your production process. So these are two goods that require the use of the same resources, but these resources can be assigned to the production of one or the other, not both. So you got to choose, and that's why there are substitutes. Examples, yes, could be corn versus soybeans, could be if you are a car company, you can produce different models of cars, could be four-door sedans or pickup trucks. If you are a teacher or the school, with you can either get your teachers to teach economics or business, or same thing, same resources, but different output. So then what happens? What happens if you have two goods that are in competitive supply? Then if you produce more of one, then you will produce less of the other. It is as simple as that. You have a certain set of resources, a certain quantity of resources. So if you allocate more resources to the production of one, then you will have fewer resources left to produce the other good, and therefore the supply of the other good is going to decrease. And if you decrease the production of good X, then you will, that means that you will have more resources left to produce good Y, and therefore the supply of good Y will increase. Example. All right, so we have corn and soybean. The two markets are in equilibrium. Let's say the demand for corn increases. So the price rises and say, hey, yeah, great, corn is more valuable, so I want to produce more. So yeah, production increases from Q1 to Q2. So perhaps you will use a larger part of your field to produce corn. But if you use a larger part of your field or to produce corn, this means that you will have less resources left to produce soybean, and therefore the supply of soybean will decrease. And of course, this will lead to a higher price of soybean and a lower quantity. What if, same thing, let's start with our two markets in equilibrium. Let's say that the demand for corn decreases, doesn't matter why. So this leads to a lower price of corn. And if you see that, hey, corn has become less valuable, all right, that's the signal that is sent to you. Then the incentive function of the price mechanism tells you, all right, so then that means that I should produce less, okay? So the output of corn is going to decrease from Q1 to Q2. You are going to use fewer resources to produce corn, and therefore instead, you will have more resources available to produce soybean, okay? The soybean has become relatively more profitable to produce, and this is represented by an increase in supply. You are more able and willing to produce soybean because of the decrease in the price of corn. Okay, good. Finally, joint supply. So what do we have here? We have honey, beeswax, well, mostly honey and beeswax. And I'm not sure exactly how we call this, like, you know, what is in the spoon. Looks like pollen, but I'm not sure exactly what this is. But let's just focus on honey and beeswax. The idea behind joint supply, it's so it's when you have two goods that are produced at the same time. As soon as you produce one, you also produce the other. Okay, so it's not like a competitive supply where it's either one or the other. Joint supply is both products at the same time. So they use the same resources. Of course, it's the same production process, but the two goods are produced simultaneously. So of course, when bees produce honey, at the same time, they produce beeswax. All right, so honey, of course, you can consume it, you can eat it. But you can also, there are also some things you can do with beeswax. You can make candles, you can use that for to polish your shoes or things like that. There are several possible uses of beeswax. So these two goods are produced together with the same resources within the same production process. And this is what we call two goods that are in joint supply. Sometimes we say complements, but careful, complements in production. They are simultaneously produced using the same resources. And yes, in general, one good is just a byproduct of the other. Okay, so we'll say that beeswax is the byproduct of honey. Okay, because there is usually one good that is more important than the other. Well, not always, but usually, or more valuable than the other, perhaps. So one good is a byproduct of the other. Example, so beef and leather, that's the most famous example. Of course, if you produce beef, well, at the same time you produce leather, or at least the raw material that is the skin that is required to produce leather. Honey and beeswax, I talked about it. Lumber and sawdust, of course, if you cut a tree, you will have logs, okay, and then you can use these logs to produce lumber, construction wood. But at the same time, you produce sawdust and, you know, like the small pieces of wood that inevitably fall on the floor when you cut a tree. And it's not necessarily a waste. There are things you can do with the sawdust. Sometimes what you can do, for example, is to compress it. So you take the sawdust and you compress it and you turn it into a brick. And then you can actually burn it, burn the brick to generate heat in your house, something like that. So that's one possible use of sawdust. So as soon as you produce lumber, you also produce sawdust, and therefore you can use this as an input to produce those bricks that you can burn to generate heat. There are not so many examples. It's a bit difficult to produce, to think of many examples. I'm not sure because I am not an expert, but there is probably a good example too about crude oil and natural gas, but I need to look into it because usually, if I remember well, the oil deposits are also deposits where you can extract natural gas often, if I remember well. So when you drill an oil well, you can extract oil, but again, I'm not an expert. You should double check before you giving this example to the students. I will double check myself. But I believe that you can also use the well, or maybe another well, but basically with the same resources to also extract natural gas. So can we say that natural gas is a byproduct of crude oil? I don't know if any of you is an expert at fossil fuels, but I believe this is the case. So this might also be a good example of products that are in joint supply. Okay, so of course, if you produce more of one, then you will produce more of the other. So if you produce more of good X, then the supply of Y will increase. If you produce less of X, then the supply of Y will decrease. So how does it work? So here I use the most, like the easiest example. So let's say we have beef and leather. If the price of beef or if the demand for beef increases, then it becomes more valuable. The price rises. So firms are encouraged to produce more beef, and therefore at the same time as they produce more beef, they also produce more leather, and therefore the supply of leather will increase. On the other hand, if the demand for beef decreases, the price decreases, so therefore firms are encouraged to produce less or will produce less. And therefore, if they produce less beef, they also produce less leather. So the supply of leather will decrease, leftward shift. And the price of leather will increase and the quantity will decrease. Okay. And that's it. So you see that was pretty easy because what we did in this PPT was just mostly a summary of what we've already discussed about supply and demand. Like the only things that are new are, well, the presentation is new, the side-by-side diagrams were not available in the previous PPTs, so this is a bit different. But the two only concepts that we had not encountered before are those of derived demand and composite demand. The rest is should be very familiar to your students. So let me just show you, because yes, these documents are already available on the website. So you have the concept cards. Oh, sorry, that's consumer and producer surplus. Blah blah blah. You have the concept cards, interrelationships between markets. So, well, basically you have the 6 cases. Okay. You have 2 drawing challenges, a hummingbird and a dragonfly. Then the summary of the definition. Sorry, you have the definitions first. So 6 definitions, of course, for each of these concepts, but most of them have already been given before. And then you have the summary. How many pages? 6 pages. 6 because, yes, they are actually, I just 1 page each. Okay, 1 page for each relationship. Derived demand, composite demand, with the diagrams, examples, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Any questions before we have a look at the last topic, which is not going to be very complicated? We need to look at consumer and producer surplus. That's one of the easiest topic that we have to teach in AS. But before we talk about this, do you have any questions? Okay. All right, let's get started then. That should not take too long. So consumer surplus is just the difference between the maximum price we are willing to pay for a product. We call that the maximum willingness to pay. And the price that we actually pay, the market price. And actually, this definition, and we should really emphasize that, this is the definition of the consumer surplus, but only for one unit. Yeah. The maximum price you are willing to pay for that unit and the price that you pay for that unit. Basically, what I mean is that it's important to distinguish the unit consumer surplus and the total consumer surplus in the market. Just like it's important to distinguish the individual demand and the market demand. Okay, but of course, at first, it's useful to start with the individual consumer surplus, so the unit consumer surplus, and then we'll just move to the market consumer surplus. So yeah, it's a difference between the max W2P, W2P for willingness to pay. That's usually how we write it because we are lazy. So W2P is quicker, minus the market price. Let's just keep it simple, keep things simple, and assume that there is one single market price for everyone, no price discrimination. Okay. Of course, how much we are willing and able to pay for a product depends on our preferences, depends on our income, the price of other goods and services. Basically, our maximum willingness to pay depends on what we call the determinants of demand, of course. And in which case are we really going to demand that unit as long as our maximum willingness to pay is greater than the market price, of course. So example, if you take one consumer, Patrick, his maximum willingness to pay is $4 for one beer. The price is $3. So the consumer surplus on that unit is $1. Okay, easy. So of course, you can calculate the consumer surplus that is generated by a certain number, by the consumption of a number of units, not only one. So you just have to add the consumer surplus generated by each unit. Okay, and you get the total consumer surplus generated by the consumption of 10, 20, 50, 60 units of a product. So that's just the sum of all the unit consumer surplus. So again, you have another example, 3 consumers, each of them have a maximum willingness to pay, $4, $6, and $2 for one beer. The price is 3. So only 2 beers will be demanded. Okay, why? Because for who's that? Jacob has a willingness to pay of $2 and the price is $3. So basically, Jacob will not effectively demand one beer at that price because the price is just too high. So 2 beers will be demanded, and what's going to be the consumer surplus, like the total consumer surplus? So 4 minus 3, that's Patrick's consumer surplus. 6 minus 3, that's Kevin's consumer surplus. So we have an overall consumer surplus of $4. All right, then yeah, I like this example. I feel like it's useful, but it's not very complicated to anyway, but I like this example. So here we have the maximum willingness to pay for a product, which is 1 hour of music lessons per week. And we have 6 potential buyers, and we have the price that they are willing and able to pay for 1 hour of music lessons per week. And I actually picked names of my students, so you can replace the names so that makes it more engaging. Okay, so yes, what I can do first, I have the maximum willingness to pay. I can start to order from highest to lowest. Okay, so that's just what I did. I just took this data and I just ranked it from highest willingness to pay to lowest willingness to pay. And with this information, I can actually build the demand curve, okay? So yes, if the price is more than 18, nobody buys. If the price is between 14 and 18, just one. If the price is 14, we have a quantity demanded of 3. If the price is 10, we have a quantity demanded of 4. If the price is 8, quantity demanded is equal to 5. And if the price is 6 or lower, the quantity demanded is 6. Okay. So yes, I can actually create my demand schedule, okay, using this information about the maximum willingness to pay. Pretty easy. And I can graph it. So this is my demand curve. This is my demand curve. So of course, because here I have those, it's either +1 or yeah, from just 1 hour each. So that's why the demand curve has this staircase shape. It's not just a straight line, of course, but this is what my demand curve is going to look like in this particular example. What if the price is 12? Okay, the price of 1 hour of music lesson is 12. Well, we can ask ourselves, all right, who's going to buy and who's not going to buy? So of course, only Anna and Shirley are going to effectively demand 1 hour of music lesson per week because their willingness to pay, their maximum willingness to pay is higher than that. And Anna is going to make a consumer surplus of 18 minus 12. And so that's 6. And Shirley is going to make a consumer surplus of 14 minus 12. That's 2. So overall, in this market, if the price is 12, the total consumer surplus is $8. If the price is 8, then in that case, this is the total consumer surplus. So Anna is making a consumer surplus of 10, Shirley a consumer surplus of 6, Cassie Lendy is making consumer surplus of 2, Yoko a consumer surplus of 2 as well, and Albert, so Albert is on the fence, right? Because the maximum price he's willing to pay is 8. The price is exactly 8. So he might or might not buy the product because in both cases it will lead to the same net satisfaction. But let's just assume that, okay, he chooses to buy the product, but he does not make any consumer surplus simply because his maximum willingness to pay is exactly the same as the market price. So this area here is the total consumer surplus generated in the market. What if the price is 4? Of course, we can make the same reasoning and we see that the consumer surplus is a bigger area. Now it's $42. So of course, it's measured in dollars, but that doesn't mean that consumers, they actually receive that as a reward. Hey, you have consumer surplus, here's a check. It's a psychological gain, okay? So it's measured in dollars, just like utility can be measured in dollars, but it's not an actual payment made to consumers, just like there are implicit costs and explicit costs. This is a form of implicit revenue for consumers. Okay, right. So we see that basically what we have noticed with this example is that consumer surplus is basically the area below the demand curve and above the market price. Yeah, so that's what we can conclude. Consumer surplus below the demand curve, above the price. And in most cases, we assume that demand curves are straight lines. So the consumer surplus is a triangle. So we can calculate it. It's simply equal to the demand reservation price, which is the price above which the demand is 0, the quantity demanded is 0, minus the market price times the quantity demanded divided by 2. Okay, remember the demand reservation price is this. This is the price above which the quantity demanded is 0. Did I miss anything? No. So yeah, if this is my demand curve, it's a straight line. This is the market price. So consumer surplus is this area. And if I wanted to calculate it, I would simply have to take the demand reservation price, subtract the price, take this and multiply it by the quantity and divide by 2. Otherwise, I would have a rectangle. So that's why I must divide by 2 to have the area of that consumer surplus. Okay, and then there are many slides on what happens when we increase the price, what happens when we decrease the price. So of course, if we increase the price, consumer surplus will decrease. That's obvious. Why? Why does it decrease? Because on the one hand, so that's this area shows the decrease in consumer surplus. And you can actually divide it into two parts. This one is those who, the loss of surplus of the consumers who still keep buying the product even though it's more expensive. But because it's more expensive, their surplus decreases. And this small triangle, it's the loss in surplus of those who stop buying the product because it's too expensive now. And if you add those two areas, you get the total loss in consumer surplus. Same thing if there is a decrease in price. So if the price decreases, of course, consumer surplus will increase. This is the gain of the increase in consumer surplus. And again, you can identify these two areas. So this one is the gain in surplus from those who already purchased the good, even when the price was higher, and they still buy the product, of course, because the price is lower, but they make more surplus. And this small triangle is the gain in surplus from those who did not buy the product when the price was P1 and who buy it when the price is P2, like the new consumers, if you want, right? The new buyers who start to consume the good. All right, that's all about consumer surplus. So then, of course, we can do exactly the same thing for producer surplus. So I'm going to move quicker on this because it's essentially the same idea. But here we don't talk about the willingness to pay. We talk about the willingness to accept. Okay, because of course, you will not accept to sell your product unless you can get a high enough price in exchange for it. So we talk about the minimum willingness to pay, the minimum price that you must receive so you accept to supply 1 unit of your product. And the producer surplus is equal to what the difference between what you actually receive, the market price, and the minimum price at which you would have accepted to supply that unit, to sell that unit. So that's the definition. So market price minus minimum willingness to accept. Again, this is only the producer surplus for 1 unit. And the minimum willingness to accept is essentially your unit cost or marginal cost, it depends. And this depends on many factors. Could be the price of inputs, how productive you are, whether you have to pay taxes or subsidies, blah, 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 the determinants of supply. This is what determines your minimum willingness to accept. Right, so you have examples. I'm not going to go through the examples because they are pretty straightforward. And just like you can move from the individual consumer surplus to the market consumer surplus, or let's say from 1 unit to several units, you can do that for producer surplus. Same thing, you simply have to add the producer surplus generated by each unit of a product, and you get the total producer surplus. And same thing, so I still have the market for music lessons, but here I am not looking at who's willing to buy, to purchase music lessons. I am looking at who's willing to sell music lessons. And I have 6 sellers, 6 potential sellers. And this, the value that we have here, show the minimum willingness to accept of each seller, the minimum price that they must receive so they actually accept to sell 1 hour of music lessons per week. So again, the same thing that what I can do now is to rank those minimum willingness to accept, but instead of ranking them from highest to lowest, I'm going to rank them from lowest to highest. Okay, so I should read in this direction from lowest to highest. And I can use this information to construct my supply schedule. Okay, so this is my supply schedule. For any given price range, I can determine what will be the quantity supplied. Okay, just like before. And using this supply schedule, I can construct my supply curve. So again, it has this staircase shape because the quantity can only be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It is not continuous. Okay, good. So that's the supply curve. And again, I can just say, okay, what if the price is $8? How many sellers will effectively supply music lessons? Here, only 2, those with the lowest minimum willingness to accept, Antoine and Angela. Angela is going to make a producer surplus of $6, Antoine only $2. What if the price is higher? How many units will be supplied? Here, 5, Angela, Antoine, Sam Castle, and Kendrick. For each of them, I can calculate how much surplus they make, blah, 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 and I can look at a higher price, 18, where everybody will supply music lessons. And again, what we learned from this example is that the total producer surplus in the market is simply the area below the market price and above the supply curve. Okay, that's what I write here. And again, if supply is a straight line, producer surplus is going to be a triangle, and we can calculate the area of that triangle, the market price minus the supply reservation price. So what is it? Is it the minimum price below which the quantity supplied is 0? So it's the vertical intercept of the supply curve times the quantity supplied divided by 2. Okay, so this would be the supply reservation price, the price below which the quantity supplied is 0. Okay, so if the price is P1, this is producer surplus. Boom, below the market price, above the supply curve. And again, what happens when we increase the price? So if we increase the price, of course, clearly the producer surplus increases. And again, you can, this area represents the increase in producer surplus. And it's always a good idea to try to understand what this increase is made of. So like the light gray area is essentially those sellers who already supplied the product at P1, the lower price. They still supply the output at P2, the higher price, of course, but because the price is higher, well, they just make a more surplus. And the dark gray area is the gain in surplus from those producers who start to supply the product at the higher price. They did not supply the product at P1. Price was not high enough, but now they do supply the output as P2, and they enjoy some producer surplus. Same thing when the price decreases. If the price decreases, then producer surplus will decrease, okay, from PS1 to PS2. And same thing, you can distinguish these two areas. The light gray area, these are those producers who still supply the output at the lower price, but because it's a lower price, they make less producer surplus. And the gray area, this is the surplus who's lost by those producers who no longer supply the output at the lower price. They used to supply the product at P1, the higher price, but they no longer find it profitable to supply the output at P2, and therefore they no longer make any surplus. Okay, and then you can actually, if we use the same example as before, you can bring together my weird supply and my weird demand, and we can find the market equilibrium. That's beautiful, right? Where supply is equal to demand, quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. So yes, in this market, the equilibrium price will be $10. And at $10, I can determine what's going to be the total consumer surplus. So that's because we only have 3 buyers in this market. Okay, so it's $12 of consumer surplus. I can also calculate the producer surplus. There are only 3 sellers in this market. 12, that's just, it doesn't have to be the same. It doesn't have to be the same. It's just random. Maybe I should have picked different figures so the consumer surplus is not equal to the producer surplus. This is not necessarily the case, of course, in the market in equilibrium. So, okay, and guess what? If I add the two, I get what we call the total surplus. So total surplus is not included in the AS syllabus, but it's going to be very useful in A2 when we talk about allocative efficiency, market failures, deadweight loss. So I feel like it's a good thing to tell to your students, just so you can tell them, hey, look, if you If you add consumer surplus and producer surplus, then guess what? You get total surplus, the total surplus generated in the market. But this is one step further. You see that I have included some slides on total surplus, but I don't advise you to go through these slides with your students, because the total surplus is not something that is tested in the AS syllabus. If you want to, why not? But I would rather advise you to introduce total surplus when you start A2 and when you talk about allocative efficiency. And that's going to be a good opportunity for your students to review what they know about consumer and producer surplus in A2. Okay. So yeah, in the market, this is consumer surplus. This is producer surplus. And yes, if you add the two, you get total surplus. But again, this is beyond the scope of the AS syllabus. The end of the PPT actually considers what happens when there is an increase in demand, a decrease in demand, an increase in supply, or a decrease in supply, whether producer surplus and consumer surplus increase or decrease. And there is actually one thing that is a bit tricky. So let me just explain it to you. So if there is an increase in demand, consumer surplus is actually going to increase. Always. Then you're going to tell me, yeah, but why? Because yeah, the quantity is larger, but the price is also higher. So how do you know if the consumer surplus is going to increase always? Well, there is actually something that is very simple to see. Is that follow my clicker? Is that this vertical distance? So if you want the height of the triangle, of the blue triangle, will always be smaller than the height of this triangle. Always. If you have demand and supply curves that are straight line, that's just a geometric property, okay? Because the increase in demand increases, basically, okay, to put it simply, the demand reservation price increases by more than the market price. Always. Unless your demand is perfectly elastic. I repeat, the demand reservation price always increases by more than the increase in price. So the height of the blue triangle is always less than the height of the green triangle, and therefore the green triangle is always larger than the blue triangle. So keep this in mind. Again, that's only if demand and supply are straight lines, yeah? But if this is the case, if you increase demand, consumer surplus will always increase. Producer surplus, of course, increases. That's obvious, from PS1 to PS2. Okay, no problem. What if we decrease demand? If we decrease demand, consumer surplus will always decrease. For the exact same argument, you can just reverse it. Yes, the price is lower, but the quantity is also lower. But the height of the green triangle will always be smaller than the height of the blue triangle. So at the end of the day, consumer surplus will be lower, always. Producer surplus will be lower. Of course, you see that very clearly. Initially, we have PS1, now we have PS2. So a decrease in demand leads to less consumer and producer surplus. An increase in demand leads to more producer and consumer surplus. An increase in supply is great for consumers, yeah, because clearly consumer surplus increases from CS1 to CS2. That's very clear. So increase in consumer surplus. Producer surplus will always increase. Again, this might be a bit tricky because you say, yes, we produce more, so that's good, but the price is lower, so this is bad. But again, the idea here is that the decrease in the supply reservation price, so this vertical distance, is always larger than the decrease in price from P1 to P2, and you can see that very clearly. Again, unless your supply is perfectly price elastic, okay, that's an extreme case. which means that the height of the red triangle is always less than the height of the orange triangle. And therefore, an increase in supply always leads to an increase in producer surplus. So increase in supply, higher consumer surplus, higher producer surplus. And finally, decrease in supply. Clearly, that's bad for consumers. You see that consumer surplus definitely decreases from CS1 to CS2. So we lose, consumers lose some surplus. And it's also a bad news for producers because their producer surplus will decrease. Again, that's the same argument as before, just reverse it. So overall, it's quite simple to remember. Anytime you have an increase in supply or demand, this will increase both producer surplus and consumer surplus. And anytime you decrease either supply or demand, this will always decrease both consumer and producer surplus, always. Of course, given that your demand and supply curves are straight lines. Supply and demand are linear. But if this is the case, this is always true. Easy to remember, right? Increase in demand, increase in supply, increase in producer and consumer surplus, decrease in demand or decrease in supply, decrease in consumer and producer surplus. Okay, and there is a last exercise, but with calculation, so you don't need to do it. If you want to calculate it, yeah, you can just practice. And that's it. So just like for the other topics, you have a summary. How many pages? Only 2. Look at that. That's magic. Only 2 pages to summarize everything there is to know on consumer and producer surplus. Definitions, not many. Yeah, 7 definitions. Pretty easy. And concept cards, let's have a look at what the challenge is. I forgot. Okay, only one drawing challenge that will be probably easy for Chinese students, maybe a bit more complicated for those who are non-Chinese, the Monkey King. Okay, and that concludes tonight's webinar. Do you guys have any questions? Anything that you'd like to ask? Any feedback, any remark before we end tonight's meeting? No questions? All good? So there are actually only 2 workshops left for AS. Next week, we will talk about taxes and subsidies. Different types of taxes, subsidies, especially the incidence of an indirect tax. We'll also talk about different tax systems, progressive, regressive, proportional. I'll explain why regressive taxes tend to increase income inequality when they are regressive. We'll talk about the canons of taxation, what makes a good tax. There are so many things that need to be discussed, and that's why next week there is only one topic, taxes and subsidies, but that should keep us busy for some time. And the last workshop will be after the national holiday, and we'll talk about price control, maximum and minimum price, as well as other policy instruments like regulation, nationalization, privatization, things like that. And this will be the last AS workshop. For those attending the A2 workshops, there are a few additional workshops that are scheduled because the microeconomic syllabus is much longer. But for AS, only 2 more workshops after this one. So I hope tonight's content was helpful. I hope you will enjoy all the documents that I designed, and I hope that the explanations that I provided tonight will help you to better use these documents with your students. And that's about it. So thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Enjoy the rest of the day, the rest of the evening, and see you next Wednesday for our workshop on taxes and subsidies. Have a nice evening, everyone. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.